So Eric retired from the position of National Wilderness and Wild and Scenic River Information Manager in the Washington office for the U.S. Forest Service, and now he does work for New Solutions, among many other things that he's doing in his new chapter. And I know Mary Ellen is also doing many things, and but she did retire as a natural resource specialist with a lot of focus on wilderness and wild and scenic rivers and a lot of experience in her career. She finished her career in the enterprise program for the Forest Service. So really excited to have their expertise here today.
Thank you for the introduction. Great to be here. Again, we're going to address the misconceptions of managing wild and scenic rivers in wilderness areas. I'm really just, yeah, and this is, I'm going to give credit to Mary for this because this was her slide. So she's actually the one that came up with the fun title of How to Manage Both in One Area Without Going Nuts. And so hopefully we'll give you some tips and tricks to kind of walk through some processes, to think through things, and to understand it's not as complicated in theory as maybe you think, and really just understanding how the laws work together.
Okay, so I'm going to assume that most of you are pretty familiar with the Wilderness Act, but bear with because if we go over a few things that it's easy to forget and it'll help us frame our discussion. The Wilderness Act is actually pretty short, kind of shockingly short, and many things aren't defined, which has caused some debate over the years. There's some interesting facts that I found when looking up the Wilderness Act because I really have to go back to it all the time. The phrase outstanding opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined type of recreation was not in the text of the original bill presented to Congress. And wilderness is much more broadly defined than what's ultimately included. The first version of the wilderness bill only contained a really brief definition, and this is what it said: an area where the earth and its community of life are untrammeled by man, or man himself is a member of the natural community who visits but does not remain, and whose travels leave only trails. So that is a little different, where now it says where it's a visitor who does not remain. The member part is gone. It's fascinating to see how the bill's evolved if you study that and to study the legislative intent. There's also been development since the act was passed. For example, mountain bikes weren't around then. E-bikes, of course, weren't around then. There's a level of demand that really wasn't around when the Wilderness Act was passed. So all this to say that the original framers probably didn't imagine some of the things that you have to deal with now. And so all that to say it becomes very challenging. So here's a few things that are worth mentioning in the Wilderness Act. And of course, you've probably read this a bunch of times, but with any law, there's debate about the meaning and the intent. For example, what does primeval mean? Does it mean wilderness becomes an island where there's no restoration or no action taken? And if restoration is done, to what stage are we returning it to? When you talk about undeveloped, what does that mean, actually? The Wilderness Act also talks about where I mentioned man is a visitor and does not remain, which can be problematic when you consider the thousands of years that indigenous people actually lived within wilderness and still use wilderness and live within it. The Act also mentions the concept of wilderness character, and this, more than anything, has been debated a lot over many years. It's it's not defined in the Wilderness Act. And it also states purposes for which wilderness should be managed, but it doesn't define these. For example, people often shortcut historical use, which you see on the screen, historical use, as historic, but the word use in there was definitely meant for a specific meaning. We've also talked about wilderness character for years, and you may be familiar with keeping it wild and keeping it wild too. We wrestled with the question of what wilderness character meant for decades. And so these documents, Keeping It Wild 1 and subsequently Keeping It Wild 2, was an interagency effort, which really sought to define the tangible qualities and sort of intangible too, I guess, of wilderness character. And what they said was wilderness character is a holistic concept, and it's based on the interaction of biophysical environments, personal experiences, and symbolic meanings. And, and so we won't go into all those today. And if you want more information, reading or rereading Keeping It Wild 2 is really worth your time. So a couple of things that are easy to not overlook, but not remember sometimes because we don't have to deal with them a lot, but sometimes they come up are some of the special provisions or what it says about things that you may go, And one of those is water resources. And you can see on the screen that president may, within a specific area, include a lot of different things in wilderness. And you can read all those on the screen in the public interest, whatever that means. And so the Wilderness Act and the Wild Scenic Rivers, how does that work with both of those? Of course, the Wilderness Act doesn't speak to Wild and Scenic Rivers because the act wasn't passed then, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. And so this is a section a lot of people miss sometimes. I know when I was in Alaska, there was talking about a water development in wilderness. And we all of a sudden had to go back and look at this and say, well, what does it say? So how would this align with managing a wild and scenic river with this information we have here? And we'll find out a little bit later today. And then you have livestock grazing. And as a reminder, what the Act says about livestock grazing is the grazing of livestock were established prior to the effective date of this Act shall be permitted to continue subject to such reasonable regulations as are deemed necessary by the Secretary of Agriculture. Could this ever be a situation where wild and scenic river is affected by this activity? And if you want, you can pop some answers in the chat or some thoughts in the chat. But this is one time where you really have to consider both the wild and scenic rivers and the wilderness. And then there's these other exceptions, which I'm sure we know about, but worth revisiting, where the use of aircraft or motorboats, where those uses have already become established, may be permitted to continue subject to such restrictions as the Secretary of Agriculture deems desirable. So some gray area there. And then measures may be taken as is necessary in the control of fire, insect, and disease. And then also for national forests, nothing in this act shall prevent within national forest wilderness areas any activity, including prospecting, for the purpose of gathering information about mineral other resources, if such activity is carried on in a manner compatible with the preservation of the wilderness environment. That's a mouthful. But how could this work with wild rivers? If you have any thoughts on that, feel free to put them in the chat as well. So you can already see that as you might be starting feeling a little bit uncomfortable, because there are some things to think about. So we talked a little bit about MRAs, or minimum requirement analysis. They've been called a lot of different things over the years, but this is the basic concept. And I'm speaking to the Forest Service specifically, but I believe this is for all agencies, although each agency has its own guidance about what an MRA looks like. And so it really is a statutory obligation, and it's derived from that Section 4B of the Wilderness Act. So this section, as we didn't really touch on, but you probably are very aware, that it prohibits several uses, except as necessary to meet minimum requirements for administration of the area as purpose of the Act. Well, what does that mean? An MRA applies this language to a situation or a project and results in a determination of what the minimum necessary is. It's not, I've seen this happen where people have used this to justify what they want to do. That's not really the purpose of it. But the Act does not describe how to complete an MRA or even really discusses MRA. It just says, do the minimum necessary. Well, what does that mean? So an MRA is normally required when a prohibited use is proposed. One of those things like roads, motor vehicles, motorized equipment, motorboats, et cetera, et cetera. And then also general administrative actions, really depending on your agency policy may dictate that the minimum requirement concept should be applied to all administrative actions, projects, or programs that have the potential to affect the wilderness character or the visitor experience. So really, what is an MRA? It's just your minimum requirement analysis. You're really looking at a set of alternatives and which is the least impactful to wilderness character. And like I said before, each agency has its own process. I'd be super curious if people have had experience with this, or if they have a different way of doing it. In the Forest Service, we have what we call MRAF, MRAF, and it's a formula where you really look at different alternatives, and you look at the 5 characteristics of a wilderness character, and you decide what's the impact going to be, and you have to make some checks and balances there. So it's best to consult with your agency, of course, before you start one of these. So I am guilty of saying many of these as a wilderness manager. When you're in the trenches, it can be super complicated, and it feels like there are multiple mandates and there's overlapping designations, which makes it really challenging to know if you're doing the right thing. And so that's why it's been great to have people like Emerick to bounce things off of. And there's other people who have done these, so it's really good to network within. But especially I would always say, which one trumps the other? And wilderness is so restricted, we can't really do anything in our Wild and Scenic River, which both of those are really not quite true. They actually can work together. And And so you may have said some of these, you may be thinking some of these, and hopefully today we'll go into talking about wild and scenic rivers in a second, and you'll see how these acts can work together.
So I'm going to take it from here. Mary gave us a really good overview of the Wilderness Act and where wild and scenic rivers might fit in. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act and some of its language. And then we have a couple scenarios that we are going to walk through and really kind of also talk to you about how there is opportunities for some overlap, especially as it relates to the similarities on why some of these areas were designated. So first off, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act was designated or enacted on October 2nd, 1968. It did establish the National Wild and Scenic River System, and its initial designation had 8 rivers. It was a pretty small system to start with, but it did create that process that allowed the addition of more rivers over time, as well as providing opportunities to study rivers. And the act came about as a way to complement the national policy of dam construction that was going on at the time by basically doing the opposite, preserving the free flow condition, water quality, and outstandingly remarkable values of these selected rivers. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act purpose is a non-degradation of designated rivers. That allows for the enhancement of river values when possible. The mandate in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act is to protect and enhance values for which the river was designated. Protect and enhance the free-flowing condition, which means the river is flowing in a natural condition without impoundment, diversion, straightening, riprapping, or other modifications of the waterway. Protect and enhance the water quality. Protect and enhance those outstandingly remarkable values, which are values specific to each river segment that are unique, rare, exemplary. These could include a combination of fish, wildlife, recreation, scenery, cultural, historic, geology, botany, and you do have the opportunity to really look at what other things are unique to your river that might apply. I know night skies has been one that has been commonly looked at over the last few years. So even though they give a list, other is an option as it relates to the outstandingly remarkable values. And the act does say outstandingly remarkable values. I remember when I was in the regional office and I wrote my first determination for the regional forester, they actually crossed out outstandingly and said, and just changed it to outstanding remarkable values. I'm like, no, the act actually is about outstandingly remarkable values. So making sure you understand the language in your legislation is also critical when you're helping someone understand the aspect of a project analysis. There are some other important agency requirements of the Act, establishing a river corridor boundary. In comparison to wilderness, where areas are designated with an accompanying map that basically says the wilderness is designated as generally depicted on this map, wild and scenic rivers are not usually designated with a map. They're given an interim boundary after designation, and that boundary must be finalized at some point. And it's usually part of the next requirement associated with the act, which is the development of a comprehensive river management plan. So the comprehensive river management plan addresses resource protection, development of the lands and facilities, user capacities, and other management practices that are necessary and desirable to achieve the purposes of the act. And these are important, especially with these river management plans as it relates to wilderness management, and we'll cover that here in a second as well. Section 2 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act lists 3 different classifications, and this was actually one of our questions. So a classification recognizes the spectrum of existing development and access along the river segments in the national system. They range from wild segments, which is the most remote and undeveloped, to scenic, to recreational segments, which are the most accessible from roads, trails, and also those may include some developments along the way. So these classifications protect the river setting and ensure new developments are compatible with that classification. A designated river can have any combination of classification. It is not just one for the whole length of the river, and those segments can bounce back and forth. You can go from a wild to a scenic, back to a wild, back to a scenic, then maybe to recreational. So The segments really are dependent on how that river lays out and really the developments and the remoteness associated with it. All right, data. People know me as a data person, so I'm going to give you some data information. So here is some of the fun, real numbers of occurrences where wilderness and wild and scenic rivers do overlap. And most of these numbers I'm going to give are specific to the Forest Service. I am going to cover some basic numbers of the system as a whole, and then jump into the Forest Service. So, like the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act developed a national system. It identified the initial rivers, as I mentioned, 8 were initially designated, and prescribed how new rivers could be added. Now we have 228 rivers in our system, so a pretty significant jump from 8 from 1968. So unlike federal wilderness areas, wild and scenic rivers are not limited to federal lands. Some can flow through mixed ownership or have no federal ownership. You can also have state-administered wild and scenic rivers. So there's a little bit more of a flexibility associated with these types of designations. As I mentioned, currently we have 228 rivers in the system, and that's being managed by the 4 agencies, and that does include those state managed rivers as well. The total is 13,467 miles in 41 states, as well as the Commonwealth of Puerto Rico. While that seems like a big number, that's less than 0.5% of the nation's river miles. For comparison, about 20% of the nation's river miles are actually dammed in some way or another. Now, some other fun facts. Oregon does have the most designations. And that, again, this is for all the agencies. And Alaska has the most miles, even though the Forest Service has no designated miles in Alaska. So here's where the crossover occurs. So the Forest Service does manage 130 wild and scenic rivers and just over 5,000 miles. There are 90 occurrences where a Forest Service wild and scenic river is in a designated wilderness. There are 18 Forest Service wild and scenic rivers in multiple wilderness areas, and we do have 22 Forest Service wilderness areas that have multiple wild and scenic rivers. So when we're talking about this overlap, it's a pretty common thing. So understanding how they work together is pretty important as we move through this. So Mary talked about the minimum requirements analysis. On the side of wild and scenic rivers, we have something similar, which is called a Section 7 analysis or Section 7 determination. And this takes place when a project is proposed within the bed and banks of a designated river. The important thing is this is not tied to prohibited uses. So much of that minimum requirements analysis process is tied to prohibited uses from the Act. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does not have prohibited uses. So the analysis process is a little bit different. The requirement for the analysis comes from, shockingly enough, Section 7 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. So this is a key provision that directs federal agencies to protect the free-flowing condition and other values of the designated river. Often the analysis is referred to just as a Section 7 or a Section 7 determination. So as shown in this table here, there's actually only 2 criteria that need to be met for a project to require determination under Section 7. Is the project in the bed and banks of a designated river? Often we just talked about the ordinary high watermark. If it's inside that ordinary high watermark, it's a project that must be considered. And the project is proposed by a federal agency or requires some level of federal assistance, such as a permit or funding. So those are really the only 2 basic reasons on why you do a Section 7. Is it a project that's within the ordinary high watermark, and is somebody as a permit or federal funding paying for it? So, as Mary said, she didn't say a thing about the Wild and Scenic or the Wilderness Act referencing the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, and that's because it happened 4 years earlier. However, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act does have information related to how these 2 types of designations do work together. So, Section 10 of the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act states that any portion of a component of the National Wild and Scenic River System that is within the National Wilderness Preservation System, as established by the Act of 1964, shall be subject to provisions of both the Wilderness Act and the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, respected to the provision or the preservation of such river and its immediate environment. And in the case where they actually do conflict, the more restrictive act provisions do apply. So they do work together. Now, the Wilderness Act does have a section it's probably closer to the end where it does say that the Wilderness Act works within and supplemental to other legislation. So even though the Wilderness Act, the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act didn't exist at that point, the general idea that it is to work supplemental with other pieces of legislation does make that connection. But at least here in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, it directly states they work together, and the one with the most restrictive provision is the one that shall apply. So what are the differences, if any, between wild and scenic rivers and wilderness? So I just did mention that wild and scenic rivers don't have a list of prohibited uses, and that seems to be a guiding force for a lot of the work we do in wilderness areas, is those prohibited uses. But some of the other things to consider. So motorboats and other motors are allowed on wild and scenic rivers, even those sections classified as wild. And just to answer our question earlier on, just because a section of wild and scenic river is in a wilderness, it does not have to be just classified as wild. It can be scenic, recreational, or wild. Majority are wild, but it doesn't have to be. So again, motorboats are allowed on wild and scenic rivers, no matter the classification. So in areas that are both wilderness and wild and scenic river, the most restrictive provision will apply, which means for wilderness, no motorized boats on the wild and scenic river section. There are exceptions, and we'll get to that in just a second. So another difference is new dams are prohibited in wild and scenic rivers. But the president may authorize water resource and energy projects in wilderness. So in this case, the most restrictive part here is the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act, which just says, no, it's not allowed. Road trail, recreation facilities, campgrounds, and other infrastructure are allowed along wild and scenic rivers, depending on that classification. That level of infrastructure may be bigger or smaller, depending on the classification. But within wilderness, we don't have roads, and we know that developments aren't allowed. So in this case, the most restrictive part is the Wilderness Act. There's a few other things. I'm just going to jump to the bottom here just to move on. But I did want to mention, we talked about comprehensive river management plans. They are required for all wild and scenic rivers, but management plans for wilderness areas aren't necessarily required. We haven't done a lot of work with wilderness plans in quite a while. Most of that work is now really tied to the land and resource management plan. So the good news, fast slide. The good news is the Forest Service manual actually has language that supports what we see in the Wild and Scenic Rivers Act. It's pretty darn near word for word identical. Again, stating that conflicts are resolved with the provisions of the most restrictive act. So here's that however, and we do have a lot of howevers for both wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. And this one's actually an important however. There are situations where legislated special provisions for wild and scenic rivers provide exceptions, that can conflict with wilderness management. We see the same thing on the wilderness legislation side too, where a special provision is added to the enabling legislation to allow a non-conforming use. For wild and scenic rivers, I have an example on the screen, and it comes directly from the Endangered American Wilderness Act of 1978 that says certain lands in the Siskiyou National Forest, Oregon, which comprise about 36,700 acres, are generally depicted on the map entitled Wild Rogue Wilderness proposed, shall be known as the Wild Rogue Wilderness, provided that the portion of the segment of the Rogue River designated as a component of the National Wild and Scenic River System, which lies in the Wild Rogue Wilderness, shall be managed as a wild river, notwithstanding section 10 of the Act. So when we look at the term notwithstanding section 10, what does that mean? So it literally means that we're going to be irrespective or ignoring or discounting section 10 of the Act, which says that is really identifying which act has the most authority. And in this case, they're saying our law is going to allow motorized use in this wild and scenic river in with this wilderness. So there's actually 12 miles of motorized use in wilderness associated with this river. So we do have to look for those special provisions because they actually will identify when we do or do not listen to that section 10 that says the most restrictive provision applies. All right. So one of the things to note, there's a lot of similarity between wilderness areas and wild and scenic rivers. Wilderness, wild, and scenic rivers do support each other through whether it be through land management plans, comprehensive wilderness management plans, wilderness character narratives. All these types of things give us details on what makes that area unique. One unique distinction, though, to note is wilderness character is managed as a whole. Mary talked about the 5 qualities of wilderness character. You can impact one of those qualities, but if you're showing that you're benefiting wilderness as a whole, that project is okay. For wild and scenic rivers, all the parts are equal, and you can't have any direct or adverse effects on any of the values for which that river was designated. Those are the outstandingly remarkable values I mentioned before. But the interesting thing is they can complement each other in an analysis. So the recreation outstandingly remarkable value for wild and scenic rivers can complement the opportunities for solitude or primitive and unconfined recreation quality. Geology, fish, botany, and wildlife outstandingly remarkable values can complement the natural quality for wilderness. Same thing, cultural or history of ORV can complement other features of value. So when a project on a wild and scenic river in a wilderness is proposed, look for these key similarities in the outstandingly remarkable values, the qualities of wilderness character, what makes the areas unique, and use that to help you with your project decision making. All right, I'm going to turn it back over to Mary.
Okay, so we've talked about these different things to look at. So I won't spend a lot of time on this, but you will likely, and when you're working on a project that includes the beds and bank of a river, Wild and Scenic River, and the wilderness, you will likely have to do both of the two, the MRA and the Section 7. So some things I've used is really looking at that enabling legislation, your agency policy, and also reaching out to other people that may have some experience with some of this. Sometimes it can seem pretty overwhelming, but there are a lot of examples of Section 7s. There are a lot of examples of MRAs, and taking a look at those and just taking the time to really think through what you're proposing and what effect it's going to have on ORVs and wilderness character is worth the time, even if it does seem like it's taking a long time. So you really probably won't have to deal with the overlap or conflicts or anything like that unless you have a project proposed in wilderness on a wild and scenic river. And here's some examples of things that have actually happened in wilderness and wild scenic rivers. And some of the most challenging, I think, these are all challenging, but some of the most challenging are projects after a catastrophic event. And when I say catastrophic event, I mean like a flood or a fire, because there's a lot of pressure to immediately do something. So these are the situations, and there's many others that you may be worked on, you may have already worked on, where you do have to consider both areas, both wilderness and wild scenic rivers.
So I'm going to go through a quick case study, and Mary's got one as well. So I'm going to actually try to be quick, but did want to mention, at least from related to two of our poll questions, a Section 7, at least on the Forest Service side, can only be only the regional forester has the authority to make a determination, and it cannot be delegated. The manual specifically says regional forester cannot be delegated. So that's an important one to know. It'll be interesting with the restructuring of things where those types of authorities end up falling out. And as related to a minimum requirements analysis, that completely depends on the project and what it's authorizing. Generally, the forest supervisor is given a fair amount of a decision-making authority. Many things can be delegated down to that forest supervisor for those decisions. But look at your whether it be the manual, the handbook, depending on which agency you're in, it actually lays out who has what authority and which ones can or cannot be delegated. So Let's go ahead and talk about this case study. This is one that is a little bit more common. So we've got a trail bridge over the charming Wild and Scenic River. It's within the woody wilderness area, and it collapses due to floodwater. The washed out bridge gets caught up in some rocks and forms a debris dam in the river. The bridge, which was built prior to wilderness designation, is primarily a steel framed bridge. The water is eroding the banks and the river due to the debris dam, and the trail bridge is at least 2 miles into the wilderness and provides the only access into this wilderness area. Just some basic information to consider. The river classification in this case is wild. The river ORVs are fisheries and recreation. And the legislation designating the wilderness states that public access, recreation, and fishing opportunities are key public purposes, and that the land management plan and wilderness character narratives also do support access through trail bridges where needed for public safety and resource protection. So that kind of gives you the background. So we do, after lots of deep thought and reviewing the legislation, the comprehensive river management plan, the wilderness character narrative, all these types of things, the forest supervisor does decide that action of some sort should be considered to address the debris dam and remains of the bridge. Installation of a new bridge and the material associated with that bridge will be put off to a later time. The more important action right away was this debris dam. So kind of want to just throw out some questions. So at this point, so is a Section 7 needed? We, Forest Supervisor, decided that we are going to take some level of action. So do you think a Section 7 would be needed for this project? Is the project within the bed and banks of a wild and scenic river? The debris dam and all the material left over from the bridge? Yes, it is within the bed and banks of the river. Is the project proposed by and funded by a federal entity? Well, the Forest Service decided, yes, we need to take action. So those are the two sideboards. So with those two answers being yes, a Section 7 is going to be needed. So let's talk about some of the important considerations related to the Section 7. Is the logjam impacting the free flow condition? Yes, it definitely is. We also know that the logjam and the washed out steel bridge are degrading the fisheries and recreation ORVs. So those are just some other things to consider as you're going through the project. So the big question is, let's talk about, related to wilderness, are qualities of wilderness character also being degraded, impaired, or threatened due to the logjam? So a big question that will probably come up is, can a logjam be considered natural? Logjams happen. Is that just part of what happens? Well, in this case, the logjam actually was created due to a steel bridge, a development that we put in. So I would say that it's not natural itself in this situation. But we also look at the qualities of wilderness character. The natural quality is impacted because, again, one of the reasons for this wilderness being designated is fisheries, and fisheries are going to get impacted by the debris dam. Access to wilderness has also been impacted, which does impact the recreation opportunities for solitude. And again, this was an important piece associated with the designation of this wilderness. Where the minimum requirements and the wilderness piece is going to be a little bit different, and this is where, in my opinion, the Wilderness Act probably gets a little more of a boost here as the act that has a little higher priority, is how is this steel bridge going to be removed? You're probably not going to hike it out. We're probably going to consider a helicopter, at least in the initial minimum requirements analysis process. So we're going to say that yes, in this case, we definitely need to do an MRA just because of the steel structure that's in there. We do have some key similarities. We've talked about them. The ORVs and the qualities of wilderness character all focus on fisheries and recreation. So there's a lot of complementary aspects of this project for both wilderness and wild and scenic rivers. As discussed, any conflicts, will go to the most restrictive provision. In this case, motorized access, and that's where the helicopter comes in. So the Wilderness Act, the minimum requirements piece comes into play most importantly. So Two more things, and then I'll turn it over to Mary. So important things to consider. A separate analysis process should not be combined into one review. The Wild and Scenic Rivers Act requires rigorous evaluation of how to protect the river and evaluate the effects of a proposed water resource project. The minimum requirements analysis is more about the prohibited tools that are being used. So they are a little bit different. The other thing that's really critical in this case is the minimum requirements analysis could probably be or should probably be done first because it will probably narrow the scope of actions to help you focus that Section 7 determination. While a minimum requirements analysis does look at multiple alternatives to find out what's the most appropriate for wilderness, a Section 7 does not necessarily need to consider multiple alternatives. It's focusing on the proposed alternative and how that alternative does have a direct or indirect on the reasons why that river was designated. So the MRA first, followed by the Section 7, is probably a good, appropriate process here. So with that, I'll turn it over to Mary for her.
Okay, so we obviously can yap for more than 50 minutes about this, but I'll try to keep this quick. So this actually occurred. This is in Oregon, and there's a creek called Wasson Creek, Wild and Scenic River, which is managed both by the Forest Service and the BLM. And there's another Wild and Scenic River that's managed by the Forest Service in Franklin Creek. So there's no wilderness plan. There was no wilderness plan for the Double Staircase Wilderness, which is the wilderness that encompasses those Wild and Scenic Rivers. There's some social trails, but the main reason people come here is to see that staircase, Devil's Staircase right there. It's kind of taken on this mystical aura because of the difficulty of getting there. It's very difficult. A lot of people really can't get there. So the prediction is the use will remain low, but there's a recognition that with concentrated use at places like this staircase, solitude could begin to be affected in a relatively low level. So the team was working on their comprehensive river management plan, where they wanted to protect and enhance the river corridor, and so they put some standards in place saying that designated trails will only be constructed if monitoring indicates a river value is being adversely impacted and its risk of being degraded. And they determined a fairly low user capacity for the area. But you can see that the potential for designated trails needs to be considered carefully because that could both enhance some qualities of wilderness character and impact others. And the capacity of what you're saying in a river, if you don't have a capacity for your wilderness, really affects the capacity of the rest of wilderness because it's kind of a pass through. And this is kind of unique because in a lot of wilderness, I think you have really high levels of use on a river and very different uses of level on a river that really affect what happens within that wilderness. For example, you might have a high level of rafting on a river, and campsites might be scarce. There might be conflicts with hikers and with rafters, and then also visitor use and determining capacity and desired conditions are complex in areas like that. But I wanted to highlight this just because you can have a wilderness where you don't really have a lot going on, but you have a draw, and that might be on the Wild and Scenic River. And so you really have to take into consideration, even though this isn't a prohibited use, but you're working on your standards and guidelines for your comprehensive river management plan. How do you write those in a way that is compatible with the wilderness character and does not affect the wilderness adversely? So I'm going to stop there because there's a lot more I could say about it, but I know we're getting close to time, but it is something to think about.
So we're gonna see if there's any questions.
Thanks. So I'll preface this by I am not a land manager. I'm sort of representing the advocacy space. Many of you know me, and I appreciate your patience with just a comment. And I can also share an example here that I'm aware of from the Lolo National Forest. I think just one comment too is just to be aware that eligible and suitable wild and scenic rivers that are administratively designated also kind of fall into this category. And the example, and the example I'm going to share is from an eligible River on the Lolo National Forest. It's the North Fork of the Flathead, and there was a bridge which is within the wilderness. It's just barely inside the wilderness. It's a major stock bridge. It's a major access route into the Bob Marshall Wilderness Complex, and the bridge itself was degrading. It also had pylons in the water, when it was originally built, and so the decision was to replace that bridge because it was causing, like a public safety issue, an access issue, on an eligible wild and scenic river. And so the choices that got made then, one, obviously, were to replace that bridge. And two, I think the most important one is the way in which they did that is, to apply all of the same things that are applied to designated rivers. And so they replaced it with a structure, obviously, that was hefty enough for stock, but that didn't have pylons in the water. So that was an improvement to the free flowing condition, and to obviously the ORVs associated with that particular river. So I think that's just an interesting example to throw in the mix here.
It is, Lisa, and thanks for bringing that up. And that's one of the things I think we've seen. I saw a lot of as I was getting Section 7s coming across my desk when I was reviewing them. The technology associated with bridges is improving a fair amount, and so we were seeing a lot of bridges that had 2 and 3 piers or pylons being replaced with bridges that had 1 or 0. So at least related to the free flow condition, we were actually enhancing that aspect. So I do think we've seen a lot of that with bridge replacements over time.
Definitely. And I think that also is, that also corrects and prevents, I think, both safety issues in terms of like creating strainers for paddlers, right?
Yeah.
Which is something that happens when you have a pylon in the water and you have wood coming down and it sticks to the pylons and,
Yeah.
can make obstructions. But I think also, not having pylons in the water, is cost effective in terms of not putting your bridge then at risk of having
Getting hit.
debris
Yeah.
degrade it, right? And we're not talking about huge, massive bridges here. Usually, we're talking about the smaller types of bridges that I think are more prone to having damage from woody debris over time. So I think that's also a cost-effective measure. That's good to hear. So, yeah, that makes me happy. So thank you. Happy to hear that.
Thanks, Lisa. Great example. I really wanted to thank Eric and Mary for this really great presentation, and see another comment before everybody leaves, that Risa put in. One more wrinkle on the lower salmon eligible, a bridge replaced was identified as a historic ORV, so needed a few special design considerations.
Interesting. Yeah.
Point. So Mary and Eric, thank you so much. That was really great.